You've probably heard me say at least 20 times over the course of this year, you can't bind third parties to a contract. And that's true, but you can give third parties rights under a contract. You can design contracts in such a way that even though the contract is between certain parties, all of the benefits under the contract, or many of the benefits, flow to people that aren't even party to the contract. The question that we'll be asking in the context of third-party beneficiaries is, are the benefits that flow from the contract, are they intended to go to specific individuals with a right of enforcement? Or are the benefits merely incidental to those individuals? Which means that, yes, they benefit, but they don't actually have a right to enforce the contract, right? To privately enforce, to sue under the contract. And so that's third-party beneficiaries. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to talk about the doctrines of assignment and delegation, in which non-parties are specifically within a contract given the option to come in certain contexts and enforce some or all of the contract. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. Third-party beneficiaries is a doctrine that has evolved within the United States. The idea here is that parties to a contract, at the time that they enter into the contract, make it for the benefit of another party. The two scenarios that we see play out in R2K 302 are the creditor beneficiaries and the donee beneficiaries. So the first one, the creditor beneficiary, is a beneficiary where the performance of the promise will satisfy an obligation of the promisee to pay money to the beneficiary. All right, so this is a situation where the promisee, the person who is receiving the promise, owes somebody else, typically money. And the promisor says, okay, Professor Archard, I know that you owe Professor Bell $500. So rather than paying you the $500 for your agreeing to teach an extra class, I'm going to pay that $500 to Professor Bell. That's going to wipe your debt to her clean. Right? But you, Professor Archard, will still be on the hook to perform under our contract. So under that arrangement, if I fail to perform, or if I do perform and the promisor fails to pay the money, then Professor Bell would have a right to step in and say, you were supposed to give me $500 under this contract. Where's my money? Right? That's the creditor beneficiary. Then there are the donee beneficiaries. So the circumstances indicate that the promisee intends to give the beneficiary the benefit of the promised performance. Right? So this is often scenarios where there's not a creditor-debtor relationship, but I want something good to happen for somebody else. And so I say, oh sure, I'll teach an extra class if you will donate money to my favorite charity. If I were to teach the class and the promisor doesn't actually make the donation, then theoretically that charity could have grounds to step in because, hey, promisor, you agreed that you were going to donate this money to us. The cases that your book uses to show the development of this doctrine, Lawrence v. Fox, this is the classic creditor case where Fox agreed to repay a loan that had been made by Holly to Lawrence. Right? Lawrence wasn't a party to the contract, but Lawrence could sue to enforce that repayment. The donee scenario we read about is the Seaver v. Ransom case, where the husband had promised wife that he would leave money to her niece. Now, you may have read the squib here, the note case, and thought, I don't really see the consideration. So just to spell it out a little bit more, the husband had promised wife that if she signed a particular will, right, he would leave the niece enough money in his will to make up for the fact that the niece had been given less under the wife's will. Right? And based upon that promise, the wife then went forward and executed the new will. But then her husband failed to carry out his promise of changing his will later on. Right? So the wife signing the will was the exchange of consideration for the husband's promise to leave the money to her niece. Right? So creditor beneficiaries, donee beneficiaries. And then there is this sort of third category where the creditor versus donee relationship is less clear, and that's something like this Kmart case, the Kmart v. Balfour note case, where because a construction contract required that the construction must be in accordance with Kmart's requirements, even though the contract was with the owner of the shopping center, Kmart was found to be a third-party beneficiary to the contract between the shopping center and the builder. And there, I think the fact that the contract specifically mentioned that the construction schedules must comport with Kmart's requirements and that drawings had to be submitted to Kmart, warranties were to be executed in Kmart's favor. There was enough indicia within the contract itself that the interests of Kmart were incorporated into the contract that the court was able to find, yes, Kmart was an intended beneficiary, not merely an incidental beneficiary. And R2K 304 is where we find this proposition that these intended beneficiaries have the right to enforce contract. So we will talk about the Masad v. Weber case together in class. A few quick words on assignment and delegation. There is a lot of technical vocabulary distinctions in the discussion of these topics, but big picture, I think it's helpful to think about a few things. One, assignment and delegation often go together, particularly in situations where you have a party who is essentially transferring all of their rights and duties under a contract to another party. This is very typical, for instance, in situations where a company is being bought out by another company. And helpful to think about the distinction between third-party beneficiaries, in which, although they may be intended to be a beneficiary, the non-party may be intended to be a beneficiary, that is measured as of the intent of the original parties to a contract. Assignment and delegation can happen much later in the life of the original contract. So you have your original contract one between the obligor and the obligee, right? Between the party who's made a promise to do something for the party that then goes and assigns their rights to some other party. Right? And as long as that assignment meets certain standards, which are largely explained in R2K 317, doing that assignment later on via a totally separate contract that doesn't necessarily even require the approval of the obligor under the original contract, that's okay. That's sort of how it works. So the assignment becomes a right that is essentially a property right. It can be transferred by the party who is owed payment or performance, right, by the original obligor. The R2K 317 standards are basically default assignability. We saw that in Masterson v. Sun. Few exceptions. Does the assignment materially change a burden by the obligor? Does it make what they owe different in some way? Is it somehow forbidden by a statute or public policy? Or, and here's the one most common, is it precluded by a contract? And so, for instance, in the space that I used to work, you would see lists, for instance, of you cannot assign these rights to competitors of ours. And that might either be left that open, or they might actually list, you cannot assign your rights under the contract to this list of competitors of ours. UCC also has this default of free assignability. Right? In fact, the UCC says, even if you have a contract that says you can't assign your rights, once you have finished your performance, you've either delivered the goods, you've paid for the goods, you can assign your rights. Now, delegation is a situation where now we're talking about the obligor, somebody who owes some sort of performance under a contract, delegating their performance, pointing at somebody else and saying, no, you now have the duty to perform. Now, typically in these scenarios, the obligor, the person doing the delegating, remains liable to the obligee. Right? Unless the obligee specifically says, no, I agree that this other party can take over. And that sort of remaining obligation, the remaining liable, might make sense if you think about it in terms of maybe you're a company that does repair work and you subcontract that work out to third parties, right? If the third party messes up in some way, the obligee that had the contract with your company could still come after your company for errors or breach of duty by the party that you subcontracted to. Now, of course, in your agreement with your subcontractor, you're going to have some sort of clause that says if you mess up and I get sued, you owe me, subcontractor. Right? So you'll pass along that liability. Right? But you ultimately still remain liable. Similar to assignment, right? A delegation of your duties is enforceable unless it's contrary to public policy or the terms of your contract. And just a language note, typically when we talk about assignment of a contract, we're including assignment of rights, delegation of duties by the assignor, by the party that's doing the assignment, because typically the assignment of the contract is such that you're saying, okay, this is my contract with the original party. I'm giving it all to you. You get all of the benefits, you take all of the burdens under these contracts. And so in some ways I really like talking about assignment and delegation at the end of our class, because as an entry-level contract attorney, this assignment and delegation stuff really does matter. A big part of what you do as an attorney, if say you're doing a mergers and acquisition practice, for example, is going in and looking at all of the contracts that a company has with other companies and saying, do we want to step into these? We're going to get assigned all these if we buy this company. Do we want them? Are there liabilities, right, that we're taking on that we should be aware of? So we'll talk about the problems, 2210 and then problem 22.7 to go through some of these issues. It's really been an amazing pleasure to have had the whole year with you, especially in light of what the last few weeks have been like. I'm so happy that we had so much time together prior to social distancing, and I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to see you all in person again, hopefully very, very soon. Please email me questions about your negotiation exercise for next week. I've already had a few people sending me questions. They've been great so far. And please, if you have any questions about the final exam, email me as well or pop a question on the forums board in Twen. I'll see you tomorrow.